Unknowingly, I was born with a bipolar brain, and I lived on the bipolar spectrum pretty much my whole life. It helped me enormously by giving me extra energy, drive, enthusiasm, creativity, etc. And it basically created or helped elevate me to a very successful life and career as a student, athlete, and leader, and did really, really well in the Army. But the condition, ultimately, the bipolar condition, the diagnosable level, was triggered by the stress of the Iraq War. It triggered my genetic predisposition. And I went into mania. It was a high performing mania, did very, very well as a leader in combat. But over the next 10 or 12 years, my manias started going higher and higher, started diving into depressions, lower and lower, more and more disruptive. And it got to the point where I was fired from my command uh, by my boss, who was a 4-star. I was forced to retire from the Army. I was ordered to get a psychiatric evaluation. And then I was later hospitalized. Thankfully, I was diagnosed correctly with bipolar disorder type 1 with psychosis, uh, got good medical care, embraced the diagnosis, and it was a tough journey. But ultimately, after this terrible crisis, I was able to build a pretty strong recovery, which started about 9 years ago when I started taking lithium and getting good care. And now, more recently, I've really imagined and created a new life. So basically, I had success. I crashed and burned into ashes, and then I came back up and am living a happy, healthy, purposeful life. But it's not without challenges. I mean, I still live every day with bipolar disorder. I have to manage the ups and downs, the rough patches, etc. So that's pretty much my story. I've made it my life's mission to share my story in order to help stop stigma, promote recovery, and save lives. And so I speak. I've given well over 100 talks, interviews, podcasts. I wrote a book called Bipolar General: My Forever War with Mental Illness. Lots of articles and blogs, and it's really my calling and purpose to help other people by sharing my experiences and lessons learned. I think with bipolar disorder, a lot of it is hidden and disguised. And in fact, it actually helps a person in their performance. So that makes it very difficult for others to see that there's a mental illness going on, because what they typically see is success, energy, drive, can do spirit, all things that the military prizes and values, until it goes either too high into mania, and then it becomes disruptive, reckless, and harmful, or when it dives into depression and the person becomes low energy, low functioning, withdrawn, indecisive, confused. So that's part of the trick of bipolar disorder, is seeing it. One of the challenges during my time on active duty, and I retired 10 years ago, is that people were not trained as to what the symptoms of the various mental illnesses looked like. So I was around hundreds and hundreds of people for years while my bipolar disorder was raging. I actually had very clear, strong symptoms, but the people around me weren't trained. I wasn't trained. I had no idea I had bipolar disorder, um, and neither did anybody else. When I was in mania, I felt great and thought I felt like Superman, smartest person in the world. Didn't have a problem. But when I would fall into depression, then I realized there's something wrong here. This is not good. But when I would go in and see the doctors on active duty, they would look at me and say, "Oh, you're fine." They couldn't put the pattern together from high energy, manic, extrovert to suddenly depressed, no energy, secluded, indecisive. And so they couldn't really put it together. So that was, I think, a big part of it was people just weren't trained. Um, I think also the military culture, like other industries, um, people think of mental illness as a weakness, as a character flaw, as you're not trying hard enough. And, you should be able to overcome it just through, you know, thinking more positively and, more aggressively and pull yourself out of it. I think that's something that is turning around in the military. There's a greater understanding that these mental health conditions are in fact physiological and biological inside of the brain. They're invisible wounds or invisible diseases that you just can't see. So I think things are getting better inside the military and in the veterans community, but still has a long way to go.
Well, in our particular case, Greg we, a lot of this, of course, now we're looking at it, in hindsight, in retrospect. So we have a much better picture as to actually what was happening as we were going through it. Because at the time, pretty much all of us were pretty clueless. I would say maybe very clueless. And so, he has what they call now like a hyperthymic personality, always very, very happy. It's a thing that really attracted me to him when we first met. Rarely ever in a bad mood, just always like super happy, gung ho, ready to do anything, have a good time. He was really into running, did a ton of like running races at the time in the 80s. The Army was sponsoring all kinds of stuff, and cross country races and, marathons, and it was all sponsored through the military. And, it was great. It was a lot of fun. And then, of course, as you kind of move along in time, you have children, your family, your jobs change, things become more stressful. And then, in the Army, that happens as you're kind of climbing the ladder, and your jobs become a little bit more, they become a little bit more difficult, more, time is involved, a little bit more stress. And so even though now, in retrospect, we look back to certain blips where we could definitely say, all right, that was definitely part of the bipolar. But it really wasn't until I think after Iraq when he came home, and not just him, many people came back from being in that pressure cooker environment. And then suddenly they're home to, having a regular lifestyle with their families. I mean, everybody, it was really hard, I think, for everyone. So not just in particular. And so I don't think it was surprising as for us to notice that, sure, that after he came back, he was depressed, because who wouldn't be depressed after going from something that was like, awesomely exciting or whatever, depending on what you were doing, and coming back to kind of like, okay, all right, need to work at 7 a.m., oh, there's a VTC on Saturday, it's like all this sort of regular stuff. So, I mean, you can see how that would be, kind of shock to the system. But then as the jobs got, got promoted, the jobs got bigger, they get harder, and, you encounter a lot of, resistance in a lot of the jobs that you have when you're higher up. And the resistance, makes people not necessarily want to change. And, a lot of times your boss will tell you to go in and they want some kind of a change agent. You have to do something to fix the organization, whether it's, go from the red into the black, or, change the focus. And all that is pretty hard. And that's when I think the cycles really began to be, a lot more noticeable. And the excitement, the manias became, longer and, more psyched up. And then the depressions really had an element of a lot of paranoia. And then that happened till kind of the end, where then eventually, at the end, everything really just kind of like blew up. And I knew that at the end there was something going on. And I actually kind of reached out and talked to a few people. I made phone calls and said, gee, something's going on. But we pretty much all put it down to stress. And then I kept thinking, oh man, once he's out of the job, the stress will go away, things will get back to normal. And I think even after he was diagnosed with the bipolar, I really felt that that's kind of what would happen. And that did not happen, and then of course that's been part of the whole journey. He had been in to see the doctor. He'd had these evaluations, 2, 3 evaluations. He'd come back, oh, they say I'm great, I'm perfectly fine, there's nothing wrong with me. But then after that he started to go into really much more of a depression. And I finally went with him because he would go to these appointments mainly on his own. And I finally went with him to an appointment, and I was the one who, I was talking to the doctor. And the doctor said to me, well, have you noticed anything different or whatever? And I said, well, it's just seemed like he's running around in a mania. That's what I said. Because there were incidents where we were living that, he'd get, some baseball tickets, and then he would like run around the neighborhood and try to find somebody to go with him to the game. And then he would like run over it was just like everything was like, bah, 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 bah. And I'm thinking, wow, this just is like too weird, this just isn't normal. And so when I said that, as somebody who was more of an objective observer, the doctor then suddenly, it's like the light bulb went off in his head. Oh wow, now he's depressed, but before he was running around in a mania, he could actually have bipolar disorder. And then that was really the beginning of the actual diagnosis.
Yeah, that's super important.
Right.
So Maggie, and that's called, in medical terms, that's called collateral information. And so for all the viewers and audience out there, I would really encourage you to try to bring someone close to you to your doctor's appointments when you're dealing with mental health. Could be a spouse, a family member, a close friend, a close work colleague, because a lot of times the doctor is looking at you, but they don't see the whole picture.
Right.
So Maggie or some other person can interject key pieces of information that illuminate the situation for the doctor. So this doctor was looking at me at that particular appointment, and he saw a very depressed guy.
Right.
And he said, yeah, you have depression. And he probably would have diagnosed me with depression, which would have been, and he probably would have given me antidepressants,
Right.
which would have been the wrong diagnosis. The antidepressants could have shot me back into mania. But when Maggie interjected that, hey, he had been manic and described my behaviors, suddenly the lights went on. The doctor's like, okay, bipolar disorder. And
Right.
he nailed it. He was correct. And they started treating me. It was still a tough struggle in an upward climb,
Right.
and getting the right medication took years, things like that. But Maggie's point, I think, is absolutely critical for everybody out there in DBSA and mental health world.
And one thing that really, looking back on it, no, I think maybe one person might have come to me to sort of maybe speak to me about some of these behaviors, but it was in such an oblique way that I didn't really even understand what she meant. Because I mean, I didn't go to work with him every day. And normally it was always in our relationship when he would come home, he would always just be like, he put work behind him. He was all in on what was happening in the family. We had dinner together every night. He played with the boys. He took them out to do stuff. I mean, it was always that way. So I never saw the person who was running around at work as the Energizer Bunny. I only saw him, that way in certain instances, but not like constantly. And so I think that's something that that maybe psychiatry or psychology is completely missing out with, and certainly with bipolar, is that you really need somebody else there to tell the doctor what's actually happening. Because somebody who's in a mania thinks they're doing great, that there's nothing wrong with them. And somebody who's in a depression might not tell the doctor that, last week they were running around and awake all night and can't sleep, and is driving their spouse crazy, or is already divorced because they drove their spouse crazy or whatever. So it's really, yeah, I mean, I think that's really something that needs to change.
It is critical for a person to own, grab hold of their diagnosis. Can't deny it, be ashamed of it, back away, be embarrassed. And I think people should think of it the same way you think of a physical injury. Like if you hurt your knee really, really bad, you don't deny you have a knee injury. You go to the doctor, get evaluated, get a diagnosis, own it, and start getting better. Rehab, surgery, physical therapy. And we should approach mental illness the same way. Grab hold of it, say, I am not going to let this crush me. Learn everything that you can about it. I mean, read books, go online, listen to lectures, podcasts, get as much knowledge as you can. And then working with a care team of medical professionals, develop a strategy and then start doing it. Start doing the work, because it is hard work to get better from a mental illness, and then do it every day. Keep working it, keep working with your team and your spouse, your family members, your friends, your battle buddies, and just try to keep getting better every day, even though you will have setbacks that you have to battle through. You will have rough patches, but you have to keep moving through them on an upward trajectory.
And that's been a journey too. He didn't really start out that way. Once he was diagnosed, it wasn't like, oh, hey, I have bipolar disorder. It was, that wasn't it. That has developed over time.
Right.
As he's gotten to more understand more, and actually, really, I think due to becoming more involved with all these different mental health organizations, I think has really helped that a lot. That you can see that there's so many people working toward, good mental health, and really trying to, help people and diagnose, and, different, drug treatments. And I mean, really, there are so many good people out there that are really trying to help people.
I think peer support is super critical, and the work that DBSA does is, really legendary. I mean, that's your reputation for, your real value added in what DBSA contributes. Um, I actually rely heavily on peer support, um, but I haven't yet gotten into sort of the formal level of peer support through DBSA. It's something I need to do and want to do to get involved in that. I've been so busy with bipolar advocacy and so forth, that I just haven't gotten into it yet. But I mean, I really get good peer support from my two sons who live with bipolar disorder. We've got kind of this little community of family community where we talk about it, we help each other, we share what we're observing, lessons learned, what's working, what's not working. Um, I'm in a group of, I'm really in this wonderful group that made a movie called Brainstorm. And what the movie is based on Sarah Schleye's memoir called uh, Brainstorm, From Broken to Blessed on the Bipolar Spectrum. And anyway, she and an award winning filmmaker, have put together this hour-long documentary that will be released probably on PBS or something like that. And from that little nucleus of colleagues and friends, I've developed an incredibly vibrant, smart, wonderful group of peers. And we really we know each other, we support each other, we share information. So I work with them. And then through that film group, I've been invited to be on other forums that are working on bipolar issues, and they've brought me and others in as what they call an expert by lived experience. And so I've got this great network of peers that are really helpful. And the circle just keeps widening. And every time I go to one of these conferences or I speak, it seems like I meet a few more fantastic people who I just love to be with. I mean, this group, I would just characterize them as smart, compassionate, happy, fun, inspiring to be with, and we all have this bipolar thing in common. So it's a huge part. Also, I would say that Maggie is really well schooled and has a good eye on what she's seeing or detecting in me, and as far as shifts in mood. Like when I see it looks like I'm starting to go up into some kind of a mania, when it's like a happy mania, that's not so bad. But when it's the angry, agitated mania, that's really corrosive and destructive. Or if I'm going into a depression, that's something to really be concerned about. The other thing, it's kind of a form of peer support. We live in Cocoa Beach, and we've made a really excellent group of friends, and I've told all of them, hey, I live with bipolar disorder. I have this, here's my book, or here's an article, or, here's my story. And here you could really help me as a friend by recognizing here's the symptoms of mania, the symptoms of depression. And when you see me going into any of these levels, please talk to me, talk to Maggie, so I can, share, I can take action. I mean, just this morning, I'm in a dancing group, and I came off of a very exciting trip for the last almost 2 weeks. And I've really been energized and kind of high and going, kind of a low level mania. And when I went to this dancing class today, one of my friends, after like one dance, said, what did you have for breakfast? I was like, what do you mean? Your energy level is like way off the charts. And I said, like more than usual? The answer, yes. And so that confirmed that observation from a friend, kind of a peer, validated what I already kind of thought, that I had gone into a bit of a mania. Like last night, I had a really hard time sleeping. And that was because I was so revved up from my trip. And so, I mean, that was a small example, but my friend told me candidly, hey, check yourself, which is very helpful. And I'm sort of responding accordingly to temper myself down.
And that's something, that develops over time, because now we've known these people, really like, 9 years, close to 10 years. And, they've heard the story, they knew Greg before he really talked that much about bipolar. Then he wrote the book. And then they all kind of, like, read the book, and, so they have actually sort of grown along like with, they're sort of like with the whole process too. Now, as far as peer things, I have to say that I have probably done a really terrible job on the peer support. I kind of, use the boys. I sort of use Greg now that he's no longer depressed. I did when he was very depressed before we moved here. I had a few friends that I would talk to, and I could kind of offload about. But not so much since we've been here, because we've really tried to create kind of a good lifestyle. And you probably know that it's so, with these mental health issues, it can be very, very depressing. People have some just awful things. They have things that they can't control, especially the family members. And it is just, it's really hard, I think, to submerge yourself into that and keep your own emotions like looking positive. I mean, that is really very, very hard. And so everybody has to kind of choose their own way as to what feels them. If it's just following your hobby or making sure that you get out every day to do something special for yourself, or if you love to garden, or like if you're a quilter or you're a runner, that you do the thing that is most uplifting for you. And sometimes that has to do with people, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's just the time to yourself where you just want to like have everything really quiet and not even think about any of that, you know. I think it just so much depends on the person themselves, like the family member, like what they feel comfortable with. One of the worst things is that if you get a family member and all they're doing is criticizing like your spouse, I'll just use spouse as first an example, or a child. You're criticizing that, they're criticizing that behavior. And of course, I mean, that, it's not something that you want to hear all the time. That would not be a good person like to hang around with, or try to get any peer support for. um, I think mainly it's just people that can kind of, friends that you have that you can go to a movie with, that you can go out with. Somebody else maybe who does have like a child. I have another friend whose son also has bipolar disorder. And sometimes we'll talk about that. We'll see how he's doing, and kind of riding the roller coaster. And her experience was very different from mine. And that's another thing, like everybody's experience is so different. I mean, people ask me about, well, what would you recommend? And I feel like I can recommend a few things, but you know, you know, the recommendations for somebody who, um, it's just such a different story for every single person, that you can't make a blanket recommendation. You can give them tips and ideas, but one person's story could be just so much more heartbreaking. I hear things, talking to Greg and people who contact him, and I think, oh my gosh, that is really terrible. It makes like our situation like not seem that bad. There's always someone who is seems like it's more desperate, or and now at our age, we're a lot older. Our children are, they're grown up, and the pressures at home are different. We're retired. So um so I think, we in that way we have a lot more choices. There's not so much hanging in the balance for us. But, I would say hobbies, if, being on your own, having a few friends that you can hang out with. I was never somebody who would have a big glass of wine or something like after dinner. That was never my thing. So I probably would not recommend that. Because besides, heavy drinking can also really go with bipolar disorder. So that's not something you probably want to, get into anyway. That's something you kind of want to discourage. Yeah, I don't know, Greg, can you think of anything like in particular? I mean, I have certain hobbies that I do, and
I would say, just stepping in for Maggie, how she has taken good care of herself. I think she's good at compartmentalizing things and not letting herself get overcome and overwhelmed by my medical condition.
probably true.
So, I mean, she goes to bed at this, at a reasonable hour every night, gets 8 hours of sleep, has her routine, her quiet time, her reading, her time to talk to family, sisters and friends. She reads a lot, has chunks of time where she reads. She has hobbies and projects that are continuously ongoing. like creative, artistic projects that are really good, both, making quilts or out, planting and gardening, exercises regularly, either, going to the gym or something that riding her bike, something, and has, also builds into her routine social time with friends and peers. So I think she has a pretty healthy, structured routine and lifestyle that helps keep her mentally, physically, and emotionally balanced and healthy. Well, stigma's real. It's based on ignorance and fear. There is still a significant stigma surrounding mental illness, but it is getting better over time. If you go back a couple hundred years, there was a stigma against people who were left-handed. They, the society thought that it was a form of evil and that the devil had made them left-handed. I mean, that no longer exists. So you can overcome stigma. If you go back 50 years, breast cancer was highly stigmatized. It was, people wouldn't mention the word breast in public, and they kept it in the closet and they didn't talk about it until Betty Ford, the first lady, had breast cancer, talked about it. And now, 50 years later, women with breast cancer are seen as heroic warriors battling this deadly disease. So you can overcome it. And research shows that the best way to overcome stigma is, number one, to educate people that it is, in fact, scientifically real, that it's biological and it's physiological, that it's not made up in somebody's mind or a lack of character or willpower. So having the medical authorities clearly state that and that be repeated and people are trained and educated in it, that's really super important. And then the second biggest thing that crushes and knocks down stigma is that people share and tell their story. Because if somebody who has a stigma and they're ignorant and they're fearful and they don't understand it, when they hear somebody tell their story with bipolar disorder or some other mental condition, that is the most significant thing that can happen to change the person's mind. That, oh, wow, okay, Greg Martin, look at, he was really successful. Then he got this terrible mental illness crisis, almost destroyed him, but he's come back and the people heard my story and it changes their minds and it changes their attitudes. And then they might go out and tell people, hey, I just heard this talk by this guy. And wow, I didn't realize this about mental illness. And, it is physiological. And so it's in sharing these stories. And so I would encourage people to do that, but everybody has to do it at the pace and in the way they're comfortable with, because there still is real discrimination in the workplace, in the society. I mean, some companies will fire somebody with a mental illness. Others work with them, get them help, make accommodations, are supportive, but it depends on the situation. But to the extent people feel safe and comfortable, uh, I would encourage people to try to share their own personal stories and journeys, and that's where DBSA and other organizations really are so huge. I mean, you're a nationwide organization. You have a megaphone. You have, like you, the communications director. You're doing a podcast. You do all kinds of things, and you get the word out. And I think organizations like DBSA and NAMI and IDPF and ISBD and all these others are hugely helpful in educating and getting the word out to help inform and change society. I would say that if you yourself, either as a service member or a veteran, if you suspect or feel something is not right, which you will typically recognize it when you're in depression.
Mm.
Because, like, for me, I really thought there's something not right with me when I would go into depression, because I'd go from extrovert to introvert, high energy to low energy, very smart, quick, decisive to slow, indecisive, confused. So if you sense something is going on, go get professional medical help. Just go get seen. If you think you have like a battle buddy or a colleague or a friend or a family member who you suspect has an issue, talk to them openly, honestly, compassionately, and say, hey, I'm noticing these things in your behavior. I'm concerned. I care about you. Let's go together to the doctor. I'll go with you for the appointment, um, and get seen. And then if the doctor gives you a clean bill of health, okay, fine. They might be wrong.
Mm.
But if you do get that all important diagnosis, don't fight it, don't deny it, embrace it, work with your care team, and start working to get better. There is risk in the military system and culture, um, where a person with bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, there's a really high probability they're going to get medically evaluated to be separated from the service. Most of the other less serious mental conditions, the military accommodates and keeps many, many people in for all different kinds of conditions. But bipolar disorder and schizophrenia seem to be ones they separate you for. And all I would say is this, um, if you hide your condition and you don't get help, there's a good chance it's going to destroy you. Your career is probably going to get ruined anyway because of the effect of bipolar disorder. You're probably going to, your marriage, your family, your career, your finances, all probably going to get ruined if you don't get help. There's a good chance you'll end up addicted, you'll end up homeless, you'll end up in jail, you'll end up dead or die by suicide. So, if you deny it and hide it, you're going down a path of death and destruction. Whereas if you go get help and get treated, you can live a happy, healthy, purposeful life. It may not be inside the military. It might be doing something else, but at least you'll be alive and healthy and so forth. And keep in mind, if you're a service member, people get separated medically because they blow out their knee,
Right.
or they tear up their shoulder, or they, really hurt their back and they can't function. So, you're not the only person that gets medically separated for a medical condition. So I think it's worth keeping in perspective and going and getting help.
I would definitely agree with that. Yeah, there were challenges like during Greg's time with that too, with different medications, things that kind of are flags. And, that can be really, for somebody who might want to have made, the military their career, that's tough because it's something that, like the job that they really wanted, then something. But suppose it's no different than an athlete, getting the quarterback throwing the football, getting a broken arm or shoulder, and then that's it, it's over. So, I mean, that does happen to everybody at any time. So that, yeah, it's just it's one of those things. Who knows, in the future that maybe that will change, with different, drugs that are available, but we just don't know.
I think for the military community, I think lots of us are dealing with, what we call invisible wounds, and we're talking, primarily about bipolar disorder and depression. But you're not alone. I mean, I think, 25% of the society are living with some kind of mental illness, according to NAMI. 25% are afflicted with a mental illness, of which, bipolar disorder and depression are a large number of that. And then the other 75% of the population are affected by a mental condition, either family, friend, work colleague, or whatever. So that's 100% of us are being touched in some way by a mental condition. So don't feel alone. Don't feel embarrassed. Don't be ashamed. Everybody is dealing with this. And I would say my estimation is that the percentage is higher in the military and the veterans community than the general civilian population. And the reason I say that is, number one, I think the people who volunteer to join the military probably are more genetically predisposed towards bipolar illness than those who don't. It just kind of goes with the choices and the lifestyle and the decisions. Second, once you get into the military, the average age of onset for bipolar disorder is 18 to 25. That's exactly the time when people come into the military. The third thing is, if you have the genetic predisposition, it typically takes some kind of an environmental trigger. Well, the minute you come in the military, your stress level goes way, way up from the first day of basic training. And then you deploy and you're shooting guns and you're in wars and all that kind of stuff. So the stress level goes up. So all of those things together, I would be willing to bet that the percentage of people dealing with these invisible wounds of mental illness is probably proportionally higher among military people, and then subsequently veterans. So you're not alone. Reach out, be smart, take care of yourself.
I think really the main thing, and I mentioned it before, but I'll mention it again, is, getting to the doctor probably with your spouse, if you're both kind of, if you're in it together. I have often thought back that if I really had noticed something and I had said to Greg, like when he was in the mania before he went into depression, that there, because I did kind of say things at different points when there were certain behaviors, and I would say, don't you think that's like enough, or don't you think that's weird? And it was always like, no, no, I don't. I think it seems perfectly normal. That he probably wouldn't have listened to me anyway. And if somebody else had even come to him, he probably would have just been like, well, you're just out to get me, because then the paranoia takes over. So the person that's going along with the bipolar person along for the ride is in a pretty tough situation when they're trying to get their person to the, like, to get help. And that is really difficult, but I think that's something that really takes perseverance. If and this, it's the same with like getting on to the right drugs. you know you'll take a number of drugs until you kind of get the right cocktail for you, and that takes a while, and a lot of people just give up or they stop taking them, which is probably one of the reasons why the military is like not that, like bipolar disorder in the army or something is difficult, because I think a lot of people just give up on the medication and then it keeps going. It's not like just an antidepressant that you can take it once a day and pop, you feel like okay and you can get through the day. It's, very, very, very different. And a lot of times people in mania, they feel great. They don't want to take it until they get really depressed. And then it's like, okay, I should get to the doctor. But then, if they're cycling faster and they go back into a mania, they're like, oh, well, now I'm perfectly fine.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's really, really hard. The thing with Greg is that even when he was really depressed, he wanted to get better. And that makes a really big difference. I mean, I know people whose spouses have bipolar and they don't really want to get better because they, when they're in a mania, they feel really great. And then when they get depressed, by then they've already cut every bridge. They've burned every bridge, cut every relationship. And by then people are just tired of it and then pretty much want to have nothing to do with them. And so that's unfortunate. But we were lucky that didn't happen. He wanted to get better, and then we kind of kept pushing and pushing, and then it did. It worked out.
I would tell people connect with other people, develop a network, a peer support group, friendships, whatever. So connect with people because you'll draw strength and inspiration and all that. Second, learn. Learn. It is knowledge is power. And if you just sit back and are passive, you're doing yourself a disservice because you can learn about bipolar disorder, depression, and mental illness. And then the knowledge you have, you can have really informed dialogue with your providers and elevate the level of your care if you take the time and effort to learn about stuff. And then third, out of that connection and learning comes hope. And people with hope don't die by suicide. You don't kill yourself if you have hope. And so hope is key to generate that. And so just keep that inspiration and hope alive.